Hey guys, in this section, we're going to be diving deeper into CSS for website layout. Now, we did a little bit of this when we touched upon CSS positioning in the last section, but we're going to look at some other aspects of layout, and we're going to start with the CSS display property. Previously, we've seen that when we create a paragraph element, if we examine the full border of the element with a tool like pesticide, then you can see that it actually takes up the entire full width of the web page. If we didn't want this to be the case, for example, if we wanted any paragraphs which are short enough to have the next line wrap up, then we would need to use a different element. Another type of element is something called a span. And normally you'll see the span element in the middle of another element. In this case, I've got a span open tag, and then I've got the content of it, which is the word beautiful, and then I've got the closing tag of the span. And this span is in between the paragraph element here. So we've got the hello, and then we've got the span, and then we've got the world, and then we've got the end of the paragraph element. So that's what the code for this line looks like. And the unique thing about the span element that's really cool is that it, by default, has a different value for the display property. There are three common types of display values that we're going to look at. The span has that value set to something called inline. Here's an example where we've got two H2s, and because they are set to be display inline, then they will literally display in line with each other without needing the second one to go onto a new line. By default, most elements have this display set to a value called block. And a block is exactly what it sounds like. It's a full width block. But as you can see here, we can change that value in order to change the layout of our element. This is how we would set that CSS value. We would have the property, which is display, which actually has many, many different possible values. But the three that we're going to examine today is block, inline, and finally a mixture of the two, which is called inline block. Let's take a look at each of these in turn. As I mentioned, when an element has display set to block, then it's going to take up the entire full width. Now, this means that if you have another element, then it's going to go below it, and it's not going to go onto the same line. Now, however, if the display was in line, then it means that if we had one element here, for example, a span element, and then we add another element, that's another span, then they're both going to go into the same line until we can no longer fit any more onto the width of the web page, in which case they would go to the next line. Now, one of the important things to remember about elements which are in line in their display is you can't actually set the size of these elements. You can't set the width and the height. The reason for this is because they will default to the size of their content. If you only had the word hello, then it would only be as wide as it would need to allow that element to display. And if you had a much longer sentence, then your inline element would stretch to fit that size. Keeping in mind this, if we go on to the very last type that I want to talk about, which is the inline block, what's unique about this, which is a sort of halfway point between the inline and the block, is the block element allows us to set the height and width, and the inline aspect of this setting allows us to have elements that go onto the same line. What that means is if we have two elements which are both inline block, and we have one that's say 200 by 200, and we have another that's maybe 20 by 100, then in this case, what will happen is because they're both inline block, then we can set their height and width, And because they are inline block, they can actually go onto the same horizontal line as long as there is enough space on the width of the web page. By changing this display property to block inline or inline block, we can actually determine the layout of our website. And the final one that I want to mention in the same breath is when you set the display property to none, then what that's going to do is it's going to make any element on the screen basically disappear. And sometimes this is useful when you have a button that say hides an element, or when you check off an item in the to-do list and you want it to disappear. This might be the property that you'll need. So the display property can change many, many different things. And these are just some of the values that you're going to see set on the display property quite frequently. In order to better understand this, I've created an example website for you at this address, appbaroo.github.io/css-display. And here I've got 3 elements: a block paragraph, an inline paragraph, and a inline block paragraph. So they're all paragraph elements. But you can actually change the height and width of all of these elements and see what happens to the blocks. So for example, we know that our block elements can change in height and width, but no matter how much you change the width, it's not going to bring the next line up. We know that our inline elements cannot be changed in terms of height and width because they fit to the width and height of their content. And we know that our inline block element is the one that gives us the powers of both, essentially allowing us to change the height and width, but also if the width was large, then it might need to occupy its own line. But if it's small enough, then it could fit on the same line as another inline element or an inline block element. Have a play around with this on this website to better understand this concept of these 3 display values. And then once you're done, I've got an exercise for you to practice writing the code and setting the CSS display property. Go ahead and download the starting file for 8.0 CSS display, extract it and open it inside VS Code, and then open up the index.html. Here I've got 2 to-dos for you. There's 2 steps to this challenge. The first challenge is by changing only the display property in the CSS. So I've got a style tag here with all the CSS, and this is what you're going to change. If we take a look at the preview for the code as it is, you can see we've got 3 paragraph elements on screen. And at the beginning, it looks pretty much the same as the example website we were playing around with just now. But the only difference is we have the width and height set to 200 pixels on each of the squares. What I want you to do is to change only the display property in the CSS code right here in the index.html. And by doing that, I want you to create a web page where all 3 of these squares line up horizontally in the same way as the goal image. Remember, you're going to have to think about which type of display you're going to need in order to get all 3 of these to show up in the same size and horizontally lined up. So pause the video and give this a go now. All right, so the first thing we know is that when we have a display set to inline, it's not going to respect the height and width. First thing we have to change is this display value. So I'm going to change it to an inline block. And notice how as soon as I've changed that, it is now a 200 by 200 square. The other thing you notice is that the 2 inline blocks, so the green one and the blue one, allow this layout where they line up next to each other. Whereas this red box, which is set to block, does not, because it wants to occupy the full width of the page. So that is the one that we're going to have to change in order to achieve our desired goal. So let's change this to an inline block. And notice now, if I stretch my page so that there's enough width, then everything will actually line up onto the same horizontal. If you had it a little bit more narrow, then because it's an inline block, it will move to the next page so that it actually can show the full width of each element. But on a normal viewing screen, so if you actually opened this in a website, then you should see them lining up perfectly horizontally. The next part of this challenge is to change only the display property again, and we're going to make all three of them line up vertically like this one. Now this is cut off at the end, but you can imagine if you scroll, they're just three equal size squares which are all lined up vertically. And we do that by changing the display property. Pause the video and see if you can make that happen. All right, so the thing that we know about the vertical layout is in order for them to not go onto the same line horizontally, they can't have anything to do with inline. In order to achieve that vertical layout, we need to change everything to have a block display value. Because what this is telling our website is each of these elements wants all of the width to itself. Don't let it share the width with any other element. And by doing this, we end up with this vertical stacking of our elements, and we've achieved two dramatically different layouts just by understanding the difference between display block, display inline, and display inline block. So have a play around with that if you fancy, but otherwise head over to the next lesson where we're going to learn about another way of laying out elements using the float property. For all of that and more, I'll see you there. Okay, so now that we've looked at the CSS display property, I want to cover another CSS property that's really important for layout, and that is the float. And the main thing that this allows us to do is to wrap text around a particular element. What exactly does this allow us to do? So we've seen previously that by changing the display, we could, for example, make our blocks go onto the same line. So maybe there's one here and there's another inline block here. There could be another inline block here, and we could use 3 inline blocks to achieve this layout. But if we wanted our text to be able to wrap around another element, such as in this case, where it's kind of this misshapen L, then this is going to require us to use the float property. The web really is an extension of print. Previously, we used to have these newspapers, and the way we lay out images and text is kind of what we've borrowed in order to create the websites that we see these days. You realize very often in the world how so many things get reused in different ways, and getting good at a particular thing like laying out newspapers, even if this skill dies, it still usually gets transferred into something else. How do we use the float property? So here, let's say that we have an image tag. I don't have the full content of the image or the text, just so that we can save some space here and understand what's going on in the CSS. But you can imagine this is an image element with a source, with an alt tag, and this is a text with some lorem ipsum that's about a paragraph long, and it looks something like this. In the style.css, let's go ahead and target the image and make it float left. Float is the name of the property, and left is the value that we're setting that property to. And as soon as this CSS is applied, then what you'll see is that our text will now begin to wrap around our image. So it fits around the image. And we've done this by making this image float to the left. We're not actually setting anything on the text here. We can also change that float to right to make the image go to the right of the page and for the text to wrap on the left. And those are probably the only two values we're going to be using on the float property. Essentially, if we had a normal HTML file with respecting the normal HTML flow, then images by default have display block. So they're going to take up the full width, even if they don't need to. And then paragraph elements also are display block, so take up the full width, and then so on and so forth. But if we wanted the text to wrap around the images, then we can simply take the image and set this one to float left and this other one to float right. And now these two elements are now taken out of the normal HTML flow, and they're actually floating around the text. Now, sometimes though, you might not want the text to wrap around the floated element. Previously, we saw if we had an image and then we had two paragraph elements, then we would want the image to be floated left so that the paragraph text can flow around it. However, if instead of having two paragraph elements, we actually had a footer here, then we actually want the footer to be down here occupying the full width and not squished in to be wrapped around the image right here. So how do we achieve this? Because as I mentioned, the float property is set onto the image and not onto the paragraph, whereas the behavior that you can see occurs in the paragraph. So the paragraph is the one that's actually wrapping around the image. In order to fix this and allow the footer to be free of this floating image, then we need to use a related property, which is called clear. So here I've got an example where we've got an image element, a paragraph element, and finally we've got a footer. So normally in the footer you'll see something like copyright and then the name of the company. It looks very weird having it placed here. Instead, we want it placed down here, like any normal footer. But unfortunately, because our image is floated to the left, then everything else is trying to wrap around it. So we have to change our CSS. We have to target the footer using the selector for that element, and then we have to set a property called clear. And what this clear does is it clears any responsibility to wrap around things that are floating. This footer is now cleared of the left float, and that means it can go into its normal position and ignore anything that's floating around it. And this will end up looking something like this. If we look at this layout of a web page here, you can see you might achieve this by having a block over here, which is float left, and another section here, which is float right. And this will give us this kind of separation of these two. Probably they're going to be divs, right? Probably two squares. And it allows them to line up side by side like this. Now, for the footer to be cleared of both of these, so above it there's a float left and there's something floating right, then we need to set that clear property to both. And this means it's not going to wrap the thing on the right and it's not going to wrap the thing on the left. So now let's try an exercise and see if we can apply what we learned into writing our own code and setting the float property. If you download and extract the 8.1 CSS float starting files and open up the index.html, you should see that we've got a bunch of code that's already written for you. If you look at the preview, you can see we've got cats and we've got dogs. If we take a look at the goal image, then you can see what we're trying to achieve is to get a block that floats to the left of the page, and another one that floats to the right of the page, and then to have a footer right below those two floating blocks. Whereas at the moment, what we've got is we've got two blocks that are stuck next to each other, and we've got a footer at the bottom. And the text in our blocks don't actually wrap around the image either. So I want you to use what you've learned about float to modify the code in the style element of the index.html to achieve this goal look. So you're going to need to think about how you can float this text around this image. You're going to need to think about how you can do the same over here. And then you need to think about how you can make this block go to the right, this block go to the left, and have the footer go below both of those things. It's going to need you to apply what you learn about floats and clear. Pause the video and give that a go now. All right, so let's do the easiest thing first, which is to wrap our text around our images. If we take a look at the structure of our text, you can see we've got two images, And if we make both of these images float left, then we can probably get the text wrap to work. So let's target the image element and then set float to left. So if we look at the preview now, you can see that both of these images, once there is enough width, maybe we can view it here in a full browser. Once there's enough width, you can see that both of these paragraphs are now wrapping around our images. So that's the first part checked. Next thing we want to do is to make the cat block float to the left. So this aquamarine block go to the left and the dog block go to the right so that we can have this kind of layout. To do that, we're going to use the float again. And if we look at our code and see how it's formatted, you can see these blocks are just simply made up of divs. There's a cat div and there's a dog div. And you can see we're already targeting those divs by changing their background color to have them different. Let's go ahead and make this cat div float to the left and make the dog div float to the right. Now, if we look at our website, you can see it's achieved that. The cat block is on the left and the dog block is on the right, but our copyright has also gone all the way up to the top because these two things are floating. So this footer is trying to wrap around both of them, and the only space that's available is right here in the center. So we're going to have to use that trick we learned about the clear property. If we go into our footer and change the clear property so that it clears both sides of the float, then it now behaves properly and goes down right to the bottom. And now we have our layout looking more or less like the goal image. Don't worry if you have this little gap here. That's because the height of the divs are not the same, because there's different amounts of words in these paragraphs. And this brings me on to an important point about using float as we're doing here for layout. In the past, a lot of developers have used float extensively and sort of wrangled it to create these kind of complex layouts. Now, I'm showing you this layout so you can use the clear property, but in modern web development and web design, we don't actually use the float property to achieve these kind of designs, because there are much better tools for us like Flexbox, Grid, Bootstrap, a whole load of other things that is a lot less complicated to use and to understand than using float to achieve this. There can be very unexpected results if you're trying to achieve complex layouts using float. So I recommend to only use float when you want to wrap text around an image. And in modern web design, this is what you're going to see most people doing as well. So it's an important concept to learn and understand, but try to not use it on everything that you see. We've got better techniques, which I'll teach you very shortly. So we've talked a little bit about layout using CSS. Now, a really important concept in terms of layout is how it should change depending on the size of the screen. Because these days there are many different screen sizes: desktops, laptops, iPads, mobile phones, and we want our website to look good on all of them. And in order to do that, we need to make our websites responsive. So it responds to the changes in the screen size. The next time you go onto the web, I want you to try and change the size of your window. So grab one of the sides or grab one of the corners and simply move it so that we change the width of the screen. And what I want you to notice is how the website responds to that. Notice how here in my full width, you can see all of these things up here, the different parts of the navigation bar. But when I make this a little bit narrower, you'll see that at some point it suddenly will disappear. And where has it gone? Well, it's gone into a menu now. So if you're on an iPad or if you're on an iPhone where there's not enough width to display all of these items, then it gets collapsed into a little menu system, which is really neat, right? And at various points of the width, for example, right about here, you can see the navigation bar collapse and go into a menu. And then if we go even further, you can see that search button even disappears, so that on mobile, maybe you're not able to use that search bar very well. So they've hidden it on this particular size. have a look at your favorite websites and see how they're designed to be responsive, and come back and I'll show you how we can do it as well. There are 4 main ways of doing this. One is through the use of what's called media queries, and then there is CSS Grid, CSS Flexbox, and you can also get really good responsiveness by using external frameworks such as Bootstrap. So we're going to talk about all 3 of these in this lesson. The first one is the media query, and this is essentially something that you put in instead of a selector in your CSS. As you remember, this is normally the part before the curly braces where you add your selector, your .class or your ID, but instead we use an @ and then the word media, and afterwards we have some brackets and we add in a breakpoint. This essentially says that look inside these braces to apply the CSS when you are displaying the website on a screen that is below or equal to 600 pixels wide. Here we've set the max width to 600, and everything that is up to that size will have a different CSS, which we can define in here. And this is how a media query works. It's pretty simple. We can define various different widths. Coming back to here, notice how when we go from this width to this width, there is a breakpoint right there that changes the display and tells the navigation bar to have a different CSS layout. So we could do exactly that using media queries. Now, another common method for creating responsiveness is through something called CSS Grid. This is a little bit harder to understand, which is why we're dedicating a whole section to teaching you about it. But it also means that it's a lot more flexible. So you could create any of these designs. But let's say we pick one of these, for example, this layout right here, and we want to do that on our website. Well, we could use CSS Grid by simply creating a div that contains 5 divs. So notice there's 5 squares here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And each of these divs are given a class called card, but the containing div gets a different style. And we apply the display grid to the containing div. So this is going to be applied to this one right here. And remember previously we learned about display and we saw how it could be inline, it could be block, it could be none. And in this case, if we set it to grid, then we're basically saying that we're going to use this system of CSS Grid to do the layout. And CSS Grid is a pretty simple system where you can define how you want the columns and rows to be laid out. If we go to the next line here, let me talk you through it. So here we're saying that we're going to have some columns in our grid where we're going to have 2 columns. So there are 2 bits here that I've defined, and they're both 1 fraction. What this says is we want 2 columns, 1 and 2, and on our website, we would create these 2 columns. 1 and 2. And what the FR stands for is to make it an equal fraction. 1 and 2 basically have the same width, and it's just divided the screen into 2 columns. The next line, if we look at this, says we should also create some rows in our grid. And because there are 3 different values here, then we're creating 1, 2, and 3 rows. And we're creating these rows a little bit differently from our columns. Now we could do the same thing. We could have 3 equal size columns, or we could use fractions to figure out maybe one has to be twice as big as the other, but we can also define it simply in terms of pixels. And for rows, you'll often see this. So what we said is that the top row should have 100 pixels in height. The next one should be 200 pixels in height, And the next one is also 200 pixels. CSS Grid, as you can see, is an incredibly flexible way of creating very complex layout very quickly. And if we go to the next line, this gap basically says that there should be a gap of 30 pixels between each of the rows and the columns, which you'll see right here and right here. Now, finally, we can change the first div here, which has a class of first, which we target right here, so that we make the column span 2 columns. So now instead of just being a single column like the rest of these, which is 1 column width, this one is spanning 2 of the columns on our grid, and our entire website only has 2 columns, so it makes it go full width basically to achieve this layout. Maybe we'll put a header in there, maybe we'll put a big heading, maybe we'll put some big text, etc. And this complex layout is very easily done using just 5-6 lines of code using CSS Grid. Now, we're going to be diving much deeper into CSS Grid, and I'm going to be showing you and walking you through a lot of the different features, but we're going to be dedicating a whole section to it. So don't worry if you don't fully understand it right now. I just want to show you quickly how it would work. Similarly, I want to show you another powerful system that's often used, which is called Flexbox. And this, again, is a big system, which we're going to dive deep into. But for now, I just want you to get a quick overview and a brief understanding of how it works. If grid is something that applies to 2D layouts where you've got columns and you've got rows, then what Flexbox is really good at is allowing you to create 1D layouts, whether if you want everything laid out as boxes on the horizontal, or if you want everything laid out vertically as boxes on the vertical, then you're probably going to be using Flexbox for this. So here's another simple demo. We've got a div container that contains 4 divs, and you can see them right here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. If we make the parent container, so similar to last time where we made it use a display of grid, but instead this time we use a display of flex, then we're saying to the CSS that we're using this Flexbox system. And what the system then allows us to do is to set each of the divs inside the flex container. So notice we're targeting each of these cards here, and we can give them different settings. Let's say that for all of them, by default, we want them to have a flex of 1. So what this does is it makes each of these cards have an equal width distribution. So divide up the width equally between these 4 cards. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now I've added a fixed height of 100 pixels. So each of these cards should all have 100 pixels in height. But then I've gone and done some customizations to the default layout that's set out here. What I've done is I've added some extra classes to the first 2 divs. This first div has, instead of a flex of 1 where it has equal width to everybody else, I've set it to have a flex of 2. So what this means is this is going to be twice the width of each of these unmodified ones. And then for the second card here, I've set the flex to be 0.5. So this should have half the width of the normal cards. And by using that flex property, I've managed to set up a very complex width ratio to create this particular layout that I wanted. And as you can imagine, if we were working with floats, margin, and all of these things that we've learned about, it would be possible, but a lot more complicated to achieve this. And you can use this really flexible system with Flexbox to determine how you want the layout to be laid out horizontally. So maybe you could have a navigation bar on the right, which is flex of 1, and then you have a main content that's flex of 3. So then this is 3 times the width of this one. But alternatively, you can flex in this direction. So maybe you want a heading section that is a flex of 1. And then you have the main content here, which is a flex of 3. And then you have a footer, which is also a 1. So then it's going to divide up the total height that you have on the web page. So in this case, we have 5 units, and then divide it up according to what you've set for the flex. So again, this is a more complex layout system, which we're going to dive into and we're going to learn more about. But essentially, in terms of the gist, it's just about dividing up the width or dividing up the height based on these ratios that you provide. And because everything is a ratio and a percentage, then that means it is by default responsive. Because if this width changes, then everything is going to change proportionally. So none of these will have a fixed width, like say 400 pixels or something. But instead, it's going to work that number out based on what the total width is, because it's a percentage of the total width. Now, the very last method of creating responsiveness that I want to talk about is using the Bootstrap framework. And the reason why it's called a framework is because it's external. So it's not something that's built into CSS like Grid or Flexbox, but it's actually something that we have to bring in, so other people's code that we're going to use. And essentially what they've done is they've defined a whole bunch of classes in their CSS. So they've written extensive amounts of CSS, and they've put different rules for different selectors. For example, you could have something called card, you could have something called row, and you could have something called container. And these all will point to some CSS code inside the Bootstrap container, which has predefined layout. For example, here I've got 3 cards, and notice how they've all got rounded corners and how they have a specific type of font, and all of that styling is applied automatically to your code by simply putting in the Bootstrap framework and then adding a particular class name. Now, in terms of responsiveness, they also have a sort of flex system, because Bootstrap is in fact built on top of Flexbox. Now, their system is a 12 division system. So let me explain this. If the full width of your website can be divided into 12 equal portions, so then you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, if you count these, you'll find that there are 12 little sections, and they divide up the entire website. Now you can say, if I want a particular div that is going to take up half of the width, then I can use this class called col-6, so column-6. And it's basically going to take up 6 of these columns right here, so 6 of these little sections. And as you can see, this first card indeed does take up 6 of the sections. Now I can create other cards in here. So this one's going to take up 2 of the columns, and this one's going to take up 4 of the columns. And added together, they add up to 12, which means that it's going to take up the entire width. So we've now got 3 cards taking up the entire width of the website. But as we resize the website, then it's going to respond. So a column 6 is going to be a 50% width. If the width was 1000 pixels, then this one is going to be 500 pixels wide. If the width was 2000 pixels, then the width will be 1000 pixels, etc. And this is not only really good for responsiveness, but it's also really good because I mentioned we can get styling brought into our website really easily just by using some of the pre-built components that comes with this framework. Similar to Grid, Flexbox, we're going to be doing a section on Bootstrap as well, so that you can learn more about this system and all of the features that are available to you once you understand how it works. But these are some of the main ways that we can create responsive websites very easily in our web design using CSS. In the next lesson, I'm going to dive deeper into media queries because it's a relatively easy to understand system, and it's not as complex as some of these three, which we'll need to dedicate an individual section to and quite a lot of time to. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, there are all these different methods and they all seem great, but which one is the best? And which one should I choose? This is often such a common question I get from students. And I want to say to you that there is no such thing as the best when it comes to any sort of programming. These are just tools. And they could be tools like a hammer or a chisel or a drill. They all have different specialities. They're all good at different things, basically. And as you'll see in the coming lessons, where we get to learn a little bit more about each of these different styles of creating responsiveness and adding layout to our websites, they all have strengths and weaknesses. So keep an open mind, and all that you need to know for this lesson is just to realize that there are many different ways of creating responsive websites, and these are the most common ways. There's quite a lot of demo code that I showed you in this lesson, and I want you to be able to play around with it, because you're really only going to learn code when you actually try and make mistakes and change things and mess with things in order to see how it works. So download 8.2 responsiveness from this lesson and then open it up inside VS Code. If you go into the index.html and show it as a preview, you can see all the different ways that we can create responsiveness. And then go to the media query HTML to see how we've used media queries in order to achieve this kind of breakpoint responsiveness. And then maybe go back and try a different method like CSS grid and see how our grid is responsiveness, but again, done using a different method. And the same with Flexbox or Bootstrap, and just examine some of the code and play around with it or change things. I know right now you don't have complete information because we haven't gone into this in detail yet, but just get a feel of how it might work and see how its responsiveness, test it out. So I'll leave you to do that, and then once you're done, head over back here and we'll go into the next lesson where we're going to learn more about media queries in detail. For all of that and more, I'll see you there. So now that we've looked at some of the different ways that we can create responsive websites, we're going to do a deep dive into one of those first methods through the use of media queries. And media queries are actually pretty simple to understand, as you've seen before. Essentially, instead of the selector, we have the @media keyword. And here you can define what's called a breakpoint. This essentially says that at this particular width, anything that is less than or equal to 600 pixels, then you should use this styling in here instead. For example, change the H1 to have a smaller font size when it's on a mobile phone instead of a full width desktop website. Let's look at some demo code. If we have a div here that's completely empty, but we give it a height and a width and we change it to a blue background color, but then we go ahead and add a media query. As you saw in the demo website in the last lesson, we can change the div's height and width when it's in this media queries brackets. This is saying when the website is a lot narrower, such as on a mobile phone, we should actually have a smaller square. So instead of 200 by 200 pixels, maybe it should be 100 by 100 pixels instead, so that it makes better use of the screen real estate and it's scaled to fit to that screen size. We're using that media query max width in order to define any screen size that is 600 pixels or below. So anything that is smaller or equal to 600 pixels, then it should have this particular kind of styling, and we provide an override to the default styling. Now, alternatively, you can use a different keyword here. You can use the min width, which is the minimum width. And by changing that from max to min, essentially you're going the other direction of responsiveness. So you're saying anything that is from 600 pixels upwards, then we should have a different styling. So you're basically targeting bigger screens with this min width. So if you think about the total possible size of a website, so from 0 to say, I don't know, 2400 pixels, If you have a screen that is, say, only 600 pixels right here, then you can use the max width to target this direction. But if you want to target all the screens that are bigger, then you could use the min width to target in this direction. So you're essentially targeting different screen sizes and providing different styles for those different screen sizes. Now, you can also combine different breakpoints to target something that is a specific size. So in this case, you're saying anything that is bigger than 600 pixels using this particular line here. So minimum width for this style is 600 pixels, and then maximum width for this style is 900 pixels. So anything that's less than 900 pixels. And in between these 2 points is where your specific style is going to be applied in here. So this means the screens which are between 600 and 900 will be targeted using this combination system by adding that "and" keyword between these 2 breakpoints. Now, if you flip that around and you change the smaller size to a max width, then you're taking a different approach. You're saying anything that is less than 600 pixels and anything that is greater than 900 pixels, on those screen sizes, let's apply these styles. So you can combine things in many different ways. You can chop it, change it, however you like. But the important thing is to understand this wording, max width and min width. The maximum width where this style will be applied and the minimum width where this style will be applied. So when you read it that way, it becomes much simpler to understand. In addition to max width and min width, you might also see this screen keyword being used, which is not really necessary by default because it's going to apply it to all screens. But if we think about the alternative to screen is a keyword called print. And what this allows you to do is to use the media query to target only when your website is being printed and to give it a different layout. I don't normally recommend adding the screen keyword if you're just writing a normal media query, but when you do see it out there in the wild, then you'll know what that means. It's just saying targeting screens or targeting print. For more on media queries and all of the different properties that you can change using media queries, head over to the developer docs and take a look at using media queries. You can see under the syntax section, there are a lot of things that we've mentioned, such as orientation or device height, device width, or height and width, and targeting different media types, or targeting different features. And there's a lot more that you can do with media queries, and you can have very complex media queries. But most of the time, you're going to be using pretty simple media queries such as max width and min width, and you won't use a lot of these other features. But as always, it's good to be aware that they exist. So have a quick read of this and see if there's anything else there that you want to pick up. And once you're done, let's go ahead and try an exercise and practice what we learned. Open up the index.html for the starting file that you've just extracted, and you can see I've got some to-dos here. Here I've included some of the common breakpoints for the different devices that you're probably going to want to target. Mobile devices tend to be between 319 and 400 pixels. iPads and tablets tend to have this kind of screen width range, and then laptops and desktops. I want you to create media queries for this web page so that in these different sizes, the background color of the body will be different. So by default, I've set it to an aquamarine, and you can see it just looks like this. It's a very simple website, but I want you to be able to change the width of this website, such as when you right click on solution and show preview, you can see it actually has different colors depending on how we change it. And if we take it out of VS Code and into the browser, then you can see there's actually 4 different possible colors. You've got desktop, which is this sea green, and then you've got laptop, which is lime green, iPads, tablets, this kind of powder blue, and finally mobile devices, which has this salmon orange or red. So you can do that. Now, another way of testing out the responsiveness using the Chrome developer tools is to open up the Chrome developer tools. If you don't remember how to do that, remember you can go to here and then go to more tools, and then you can go to developer tools. That's how you open up this pane. And then if you click on this little button right here, then you can change the dimensions to, for example, an iPhone SE, or to an iPhone 12 or an iPad Air. And it doesn't really do a lot of the bigger screens, but you can change it to responsive, and then you can change this size however you like, and you can also type it in here if you want. So this is a really neat way of testing out responsiveness in Chrome. Pause the video and go ahead and complete this exercise. All right, so let's take a look at the solution code together. Now, notice how essentially all we need is just 4 different media queries. For the first one, I said that mobile devices are usually between 319 and 480 pixels. Now, you could simply just target a max width of 480, or if you really want to, you can also have a minimum width in there so that you actually are specific about that mobile device size. So we could put 319 right in here, but normally you're not really going to display your website on anything that's less than mobile size, right? Like there's not that many things that are narrower than 320 pixels. So you could do it either way, it doesn't really matter. But this is one option. Now, the next breakpoint we've got is the iPad and tablet size between 480 and 120. So we're using that min width and max width combo that you see right here to find that particular size and turn it powder blue. And then we do the same for the laptop size. And finally, we simply define a min width for our desktop so that anything that's larger than 1601 pixels gets a color of sea green. Hope that was easy enough. And if you had any problems, have a look at the solution code. But most importantly, it should work when you test it out. That's all for media queries. In the next lesson, we've got a final project for this section. So head over there once you're ready. All right, it's time for the project for this section. And in this project, we're going to be creating a beautiful website for a web design agency. Usually with web design agencies, you'll see them demonstrating their best work, but their websites are usually quite simple. So something with a big block of text telling people what they do, and then just simple, clean design. This is what we're going to be creating. We're going to be a creative design agency at dev.com, and we've got 2 little blocks of text that describes a little bit about our work. And finally, at the bottom, we've got a footer with our company motto, create, develop, design. But more importantly, our website actually scales responsively. So when we create our website, we're going to make sure that when it's displayed on a smaller screen, namely an iPhone, that our blocks now change and are centered and are responsive to make better use of the screen real estate. So instead of having it side by side, such as here, where we've got one block here and then one block here, when the screen size is a certain size, they actually stack on top of each other. So this is going to require a little bit of the knowledge that you learned this lesson about the display property, floats, and also responsiveness. Go ahead and download the starting project. The first thing I want you to do is to go ahead and open up the index.html and take a look at the code that we've already put in here for you. You can, of course, design everything completely from scratch, but I think it's important that we actually have a good pace of learning and we're practicing the things that we've actually just learned about rather than doing everything from scratch and not focusing on the important things. Go ahead and show it as a preview on the right. And if you want to see it better, copy that URL and put it into your browser. Now you can see this is basically just kind of like plain HTML, right? We've got some nice fonts in here, we've got some images, we've got some text, but essentially it hasn't really been designed for layout. And that's what we learned all about in this section. So now I want you to right click on the solution.html, show preview, take this URL and put it up side by side. Now, one way you can solve this project is to simply aim for this exact same layout. I'm not going to give you too many clues about how to achieve this layout. I think it's time that you actually figure out how to break down a problem and see if you can create something similar. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. You could just aim for similar. But the important thing to remember is look at how this is laid out. You've got an image, you've got text that's floating next to it, you've got these two different sections that are completely separate from each other. And then when you change the dimensions, when you hit a certain breakpoint, this is pretty much for mobile, around sort of 600-ish, then it actually stacks on top of each other. Using what you've learned in this section, you should be perfectly able to add the modifications to the index.html to create this look and feel. Now, I want to leave this up to you. You can actually create an entirely different website if you want to by modifying this starting file. You could lay it out however you like using whichever methods you've learned. It doesn't have to end up looking like this. As long as it looks beautiful to your eyes, I'm happy with it. But remember, I want you to try out putting in responsiveness and try out some of the things you learned in this section, such as block and inline block and floats. Just put some of those things into the CSS so that you have some practice doing these things. Once you're done, you can take a look at the solution code to see how I achieved this particular layout. And you can look back at some of the previous lessons if you're not quite sure how I achieved it in the solution code. But I recommend don't look at the solution code until you're happy with your creation. So now go ahead, download starting files, modify the layout. And if you've created something completely different from the solution and you think it's amazing, you want to show off to everybody, then go ahead and include a screenshot in the Q&A so we can all admire your hard work. So now it's time for you to shine and for you to design and use CSS to your heart's content to create a beautiful website of your own making. So have a go at that now. I hope that was fun for you and you managed to create something really beautiful. I want to quickly point out some of the things in my solution code that I want to draw your attention to in case you got stuck on how to recreate the layout that I had in the solution. So the first thing I want you to notice is here I've created a span, giving it a different class. That means that in the solution, I can target that particular class, creative, and give it a different color. That's how I managed to have this part be blue rather than having it all the same color. But layout wise, it's completely within the same flow because it's simply an inline element that slots in. That's the first thing I want to draw your attention to. The second thing is notice how I've got a media query targeting 680 pixels and below. If you remember from previously, this is going to give us access to a lot of the smaller devices where maybe our two-sided sort of blocks won't work so that we get that responsiveness where they stack on top of each other. And the way that I've made them stack on top of each other is by simply changing the cards to have a display of block so that they occupy the full width. And then I've changed the width to 100% so that they go from edge to edge, change the text to justify so that instead of being left aligned, as you see here, they actually try to occupy the full width and the spaces get stretched out so that we have these clean lines either side of the paragraphs. And of course, the way that we've managed to get these cards to go to the left and the right is using what we learned about float, float left and float right. So all in all, the solution should be easy enough to understand. The only thing you might have never seen before is this object fit. And what I want you to do, if you're not quite sure about some code that you see in the solution code, is to simply Google for that property on MDN Developer Docs and read up on it, because it's usually something simple enough to simply understand by using the docs. And this is an important workflow in any professional web developer's life, so it's important to get used to it. I hope you had fun in this project, and I'll see you in the next section.